Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zevachim daf Samach Aleph. I will remind everyone the daf for Shabbat now is usually even up before Friday morning, and you can always find it using the calendar view, which is a very useful tool on our website, on our new site, that you can kind of click to the calendar and see what dafim are on what days, and you can find the daf that day. Like if you know you're still behind and haven't done Monday's daf, just click on calendar view. You can find it on any daf page, and you can go back to Monday and click right there and get into that shir. So the Shabbat daf will be up, and you can find it on the calendar ahead of time. It won't appear as today's daf on Friday, which is a much better system, even for those who may have gotten used to that. But Friday's daf will be on Friday at the top. Shabbat's daf will be up when Saturday hits. Okay, so with that, we'll get started. We have a short daf, so it gives us time for some interesting tangents. Gemara always likes to tangent off, so it's nice if we get to also do it once in a while. Yesterday we talked about, let's just go back and remember what we were up to. Rabbi Elazar at the bottom of Samach Hamad Aleph, we were talking about the Mizbeach, and the Mizbeach that's nifgam, that's damaged. You can't eat the Shayrei Mincha anymore, even though you've done everything on the altar, and now the altar gets damaged. You can't eat what's left, which you're supposed to be able to eat, and you can't eat any kodshim really, and they learned that all from a pasuk. Then we had a whole question, what about kodshim kalim? And which only have to be eaten in Jerusalem, so it sounds like it doesn't really matter if the Mizbeach is damaged. What does it have to do with it? But we brought this opinion, Abaye brought the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael, who said basically that because, we had this whole debate about Kedusha, what if you say Kedusha Rishona, Kedusha L'Shata, and didn't, Lati Lavo, or is the original sanctity, was it not for future generations, or was it forever? Is the area always sanctified? Anyway, we got off on that a little bit, and then basically explained that we hold that it wasn't Kidsha, and we're talking about a case where the Bechor, we have this case with the Bechor, just like the Dam has to be b'mizbeach, also the Basar needs to be on the Mizbeach. And that, they gave a case that was very parallel to what we were talking about, where everything of the Bechor was done, just not having the meat eaten, and you still needed the Mizbeach, and there, from that opinion and that explanation of Rabbi Yishmael, Abaye proves his opinion. Came Rabbi Yirmia and said, you stupid Babylonians. Okay, which, by the way, I wanted to think about that statement for a minute. First of all, on the Hebrew side of our site and the extra content, Rav Huna has a whole shiur on someone insulting somebody else and the halachot of insulting and some interesting things about that if you want to delve into it more. But anyway, I wanted to compare this statement and the statement that his rabbi makes. His rabbi is Rabbi Zera, and they're both Olim Chadashim, so to speak. Okay, they both came from Babylonia, not so to speak, they are Olim Chadashim. They came to Israel, and then one of them, Rabbi Yirmia, the student, insults Babylonians by saying Bablai Tipshat. Rabbi Zera, on the other hand, says something similar but different. He uses what we call positive language. Avirah de Eretz Yisrael machkim. He said the air of Israel makes you smarter. Okay, so that's kind of almost saying the Israelis are smarter, but it doesn't mean the Babylonians are stupid. I mean, maybe it means that, but it's worded in a very more positive formulation, whereas Yirmiya's student kind of took it into a negative place. Okay, but anyway, the point being, he says, we have this contradiction between two sources, and the only way to resolve the contradiction is to say one source is talking about kodshim, one is talking about kodshim kalim, and kodshim kalim can be eaten, and kodshim can't be eaten. Okay, we'll go back to that braita in a minute, but first I want to get off on a bit of a tangent into this topic of Kedusha Rishona, Kedusha L'Shata, Kedusha L'Atid Lavo. First thing I will tell you that Din and Daf this week of Alana Steinhain is specifically on this topic of Kedusha. She brings in some of the sources that I'm bringing, but she brings in a lot more sources and goes a lot more in depth into the topic of this whole idea of the Kedusha from the beginning and kind of what happens to it. But what I want to do is I want to show you just one thing, because we don't have a lot of time in Daf Shir to go too much in depth, but I want to show you the Rambam and a machloka between the Rambam and the Ravina about this topic. Okay, so we're going to share screen and we're going to show you some sources. So the Rambam in Hilchot Beis HaBechira, which is it's the first book in Sefer Avoda, the first halachot in Sefer Avoda, it's all about Avodah of the temple. In chapter 6, 13 to 16, I didn't have a chance to translate, but you can find it on Sefaria translated. Also, Alana brought a lot of this and it's translated in hers. He basically paskins, on this machloket of, is the sanctity forever? He says, yes. It was sanctified from the beginning, Kedusha Rishona on the end of Yud Gimel. He says, Ubamenit kadsha b'kedusha rishona shekidusha Shlomo shu kidesh azara v'Yerushalayim. That was the pasuk we saw, that Shlomo sanctified the azara, he sanctified Jerusalem. Lishatan v'kichan lati lavo. He did it for his time and for all future generations. And here comes the big, crazy line of the Rambam. Lefichach, and it's not really his chiddush. Okay, I will quote it by him, but it's really Rabbi Yeshua in Masechet Eduyot. Lefichach makrivim korbanot kulan alfa pi she'ein sham bayit banui. Says, therefore, we can bring sacrifices today because the sanctity is there and we're allowed to bring sacrifices. And furthermore, ochlim kodshei kodshim b'chol azara alfa pi she'i chareva. You can eat in the area that was the azara. Okay? The big nafkamina, by the way, for our time is, do you get karet if you go in tamei to the mikdash? Okay? And that's why people are careful when they go to, right, you go to the mikvah before you go to Abaye for this reason. Because otherwise, potentially, you could get karet if it's really the kedusha is there. The big nafkamina is also, can you bring sacrifices? But no one these days is really trying to bring sacrifices. But it would be this issue of karet and whether you're chayav. So he basically says that the first thing that's interesting is he says you can sacrifice korbanot today, and you can even eat the kodshim in the azara. Right? Hard to imagine. Then he makes a very interesting distinction. Now, if I had asked you, there's kedusha haaretz, which is for trumot and masrot, and all those halachot dependent on the land, and there's this kedusha rishona of the mikdash. Which would you think would be the more likely one to still be applicable today? Right? You'd probably say kedusha haaretz. Well, the Rambam says the exact opposite. He says b'mikdash v'Yerushalayim, and here he gives a reason for it. The kedusha rishona k'chala tilavo, but b'kedusha shar Eretz Yisrael for shvit, for shmita, masrot, and all that, lo k'chala tilavo. Okay, now I shouldn't say it the way I said it. That he says it's not relevant. It's not braita today. But what he did say is the first sanctity of the land, when Yeshua came and conquered the land, that was not permanent. Why not? He says the first sanctity of the temple is for the God's presence. That cannot be canceled. But, and he quotes a pasuk, I will destroy your mikdashim. And the Chachamim said, even though they're destroyed, they're still called your mikdashim. They're still sanctified. But Shemitah, he says, and all those other halachot, depending on the land, are because it's kibush rabim. That's from conquering. And since they were conquered by other people, that batel kibush, the conquering is gone, and therefore there's no Torah obligation for Trumot Masukah. Okay, he's done two steps so far. He said kedusha is kedusha latilavo, and therefore we can do korbanot. And then he says, and I'm going to distinguish between that and kedusha haaretz, because kedusha haaretz was by conquering, and conquering they were reconquered. And others conquered it after them, and therefore that sanctity was no longer there. However, he makes one more jump. When Ezra came, though, now Ezra didn't conquer. How did he acquire the land? By chazaka. Remember Bava Batra and living in the land for 3 years? And he says something very interesting, which is hard to understand. Ulefichach kol makom shechziku ba'olei Bavel v'nikadesh b'kedushat Ezra Shniya hu mekudash hayom. Even though the land was taken from them, he says. But chazaka, for whatever reason, we don't know why, is stronger than conquering. That's just an interesting thing to think about, why he would think the chazaka couldn't be undone, whereas conquering was. So in the end, he thinks both kedusha haaretz and kedusha mikdash are still relevant today, but for different reasons. Okay? And if it was just by conquering, that wouldn't have been enough. Okay? The Ravid comes and attacks him and says, I don't know where he gets this from. He says, Svarat, that's Moizo, he made this up. I don't know where he gets it from. He says, Lo yadati me'ayin lo. And then he starts quoting all sorts of sources to go against the Rambam. Okay, and he basically says, it's definitely not kishala ati lavo. He doesn't think that you could do korbanot today. The Kesef Mishnah comes and supports the Rambam and explains all the sources that the Rambam is based on. And he starts with Rabbi Yeshua, and he says the halacha is like Rabbi Yeshua in general. When he disagrees with Rabbi Eliezer, there was this disagreement in Eduyot about this issue, and basically he supports the Rambam. However, what I wanted to point out is where the Kesef Mishnah ends. Kesef Mishnah ends and says, but I don't understand about the Rambam. Eini yodea ma koch chazaka gadol mikoch kibush. He says, I didn't get that last point though. I don't know why he said the chazaka is stronger than kibush, and why, right? It would seem like, he doesn't really understand what the Rambam gets from. Anyway, super interesting source, a very basic machloket, which, like I said, has huge ramifications for going to Abaye today if you're impure, right? Because how could you go there if you're impure? You could get karet. You're going into the temple area. And that's why people generally, besides going to the mikveh before you go up to Abaye, but they generally stay away from the area where the sanctity is the kedushat hasara, right? There's always, you can't go here, you can't go there, and all that. Not to get into all the political issues of going to Abaye, putting that aside. Okay, so that's a super interesting topic, and like I said, if you want more about it, you can listen to Alana Steinhand's Shir of Din and Daf. Okay, with that, we're going to continue with our daf. So we have now this issue of Abaye, who said we have a hekesh based on Rabbi Yishmael, and the hekesh says the dam and the basal, right, we're going to be makish one to the other. Since the dam needs the mizbeach, also the basar eating the meat needs the mizbeach, and that's bechor, which is kodshim kalim. The assumption is we can learn from here to all kodshim kalim. Rabbi Yirmia said, no way. We have a contradiction between two sources. One says while they were in the camp, right, while they were bishatzi lukamasao, when they were moving and the mizbeach was not in its place, the kodshim were nifsalim, they were disqualified. And the second source said, in two places the kodshim were eaten, which we assumed meant, what's two places? When the camp is moving and when the camp is not moving, when they're camped. Whether the mizbeach is in its place, whether it's not in its place, the kodshim can be eaten. So he says the only way to resolve this is distinguish between kodshim kalim. Kodshim can't be eaten, kodshim kalim can be eaten. Okay, that's his resolution. Now we're going to start from the bottom of Samacham Bet, Ravina. I'm a Ravina. Idividi b'kodshim kalim velo kashi. Says, I can resolve this according to Abaye. How so? Very simply, they're both talking about kodshim kalim. One says kodshim kalim can't be eaten. One says kodshim kalim can be eaten. How do I explain that? Very simply, Rabbi Yishmael, Rabbanan. There's Rabbi Yishmael's opinion. There's the Rabbi's opinion. The opinion we saw yesterday was Rabbi Yishmael, who says we make this hekesh between the blood and the meat, right? So just like the blood needs the mizbeach, the meat needs the mizbeach, can't be eaten. But Rabbanan, the other source that says you can eat them, is the rabbi's position who disagrees with Rabbi Yishmael and doesn't make that hekesh. Okay, we didn't see there was a dissenting opinion, but he's claiming there's a dissenting opinion. And that's what's reflected in these two braitot. It's two different opinions. So there's no contradiction. It's just two different opinions. The Gemara suggests a second possibility. That was all to say, or really a third possibility to resolve the contradiction. One was Rabbi Yirmia, right? Kodshim kalim, kodshim. Ravina says they're both kodshim kalim, but two different opinions. The third option is to say, both are kodshim, umay b'shnei makomot. Oh, wait. You thought Shnei Makomot was when it's stationary and when it's moving? No. Shnei Makomot means something else. And this is all a complete issue that has to do with kodshim. Has absolutely nothing to do with our topic. It doesn't have anything to do with kodshim kalim. We're looking for kodshim kalim. This isn't even talking about kodshim kalim. Okay, this is the problem when it doesn't spell out what they're talking about. Just say kodshim. They don't say we're talking about kodshim. We're talking about kodshim kalim. Right? So the first resolution is 1 and 1. The second was it's all kodshim kalim and it's two different opinions. Third is it's all kodshim and, okay, now it gets a little tricky because Rashi is going to read this next line not according to the simple reading of the line. Okay, so we're going to read this line and then we'll see. Umay b'shnei makomot kodem sheyamidu leviim et hamishkan. Okay, so one makom, we have to two makomot. So one is, now, literally the words here mean before the Leviim put up the Mishkan, which sounds like they're saying, okay, there's the Mishkan, which is the borders, right, which is the, now we're talking about, let's just be clear, we're talking about eating kodshim. What do you need for kodshim? Azara, right? What do you need for Azara? Well, you need walls. What if the Mishkan was erected, the Mizbeach was erected, but they hadn't yet put up the walls of the Mishkan? Remember, they camped and moved. So every time they moved, they'd have to rebuild the Mishkan. So they put up the Mizbeach and they hadn't yet put up the walls. And then the Shnei Makomot is telling you when, okay, this is the simple reading. Rashi is going to say this is not the reading, and I just want to read it the simple way first to explain why Rashi doesn't agree with this reading. And let's just read one more line. Turning to Amud Bet now. And after they take apart the Mishkan and the Mizbeach is still there. So in other words, either they have the Mizbeach and then they build the walls later, but before they build the walls, you want to be able to eat the kodshim there. And it says you can. And also if the Mizbeach is there and they've already taken down the walls, when they take apart the Mishkan, then also. Now, Rashi says you can't possibly explain it this way because, number one, he says, that's not the way you did it. Okay, you don't put the mizbeach and then build the walls. You always put up the walls first, and then you put the mizbeach. So there's no way we would ever have the mizbeach first, and then the walls put up after. So he says that can't be what it means. And second issue is, even if you say, which Tosfot actually claims, that what it's talking about is if you did it wrong, okay, let's say you built the whole thing in the wrong way. You put the mizbeach first, even though you're not supposed to. He says, we already saw in a Gemara, it can't be that, because if you were to slaughter korbanot before you put up the Mishkan, it's disqualified. So that can't be the explanation because we're talking about where you could eat the meat and it's not disqualified. So Rashi has to, he has no choice, but to explain again. Tosfot has a whole different way of reading the sugya, but we're going to stick with Rashi. So what Rashi says is instead of before they put up the Mishkan, okay, and this is what I had to explain to you why Rashi has such difficulty, and I had to explain it because it really makes no sense what Rashi says. Rashi says before means, okay, I'm going to read it in the third line of Rashi, Ba'od hamishkan natoy kemishpato. Actually, we're talking about before they take everything apart, when everything is completely in its place. Okay, so if you remember before we said, what are the two? The two are when they're camped and when they're moving. Now, obviously, we only really care about when they're moving. Obviously, when they're camped, you can eat the kodshim kalim, right? Same thing here. We're going to have the obvious case and the less obvious case. The obvious case is when the mizbeach is in its place and the walls are in their place. Okay, that's the first case. So even though it says before they put up the Mishkan, it doesn't really mean before. It means when it's all established. So big problem with the pshat reading, according to Rashi, but Rashi is pushed into a corner because he says it makes no sense to read it, the simple reading. And then after they take apart the Mishkan. So here's the big chidush, which is now the way they would do it is like this, again, going to the order. When you would camp, you would set up camp by first putting up the Mishkan walls, then putting up the altar. When you leave, you first take away the Mishkan walls, and then you take away the altar. So, if that's the order, so now we get to the case where you take apart the walls, and you haven't yet moved the Mizbeach. The Mizbeach is still in its place. And the Azara, what used to be the Azara, which had walls around it, or curtains, now doesn't have any border there. So, even then you're allowed to, since the Mizbeach is still in its place, you're allowed to eat the kodshim. And here's the chidush. This is why the braita need to tell you this. Ma'u detema ifsale biyotze kamash malan. You might have thought, once there's no azara walls, maybe there's no azara anymore. And basically, if you remember, you're not allowed to take kodshim outside the walls of the azara. Well, now that the border's gone, maybe taking it anywhere outside the mizbeach is considered outside the azara. It's not in the azara anymore because there is no azara. You might have thought that, kamash malam, but this braita is telling you, and that's why this braita has nothing to do with eating kodshim kalim when the mizbeach is not there, because first of all, the mizbeach is there, and second of all, the topic is kodshim, not kodshim kalim. And the question is, if the mizbeach is up and the walls are gone, you can still eat in the area that was designated as the azara, because it's still sanctified just because they moved it, right? Just because they took away the walls doesn't mean that if the mizbeach is there, you can eat your kodshim in the area where the azara was. Now the Gemara asks, Ema hachinami, maybe what you just suggested, that you might have thought it's disqualified, maybe that is true. Like, where do you get that this is the case? Okay, so we're explaining the braita in such a way that the Gemara says, does that really make any sense? It does seem like you're outside the azara because there's no walls anymore. So they say no, because Amar Kra, v'nasa ohel moed. It says, and they carried Ohel Moed, and the Ohel Moed would move. Now, how could the Ohel Moed move? The Ohel Moed is the area where the Mishkan is. There is no area where the Mishkan is once you take away the walls. So they learn from here, Afal Pisha Nasa Ohel Moed. Even though they camped, even though they took down the walls, it's still the area where it was. It's still considered Ohel Moed. Okay, at least when the Mizbeach is still there. Okay, so from there they learn the halacha, and again, that was our second resolution, or third resolution really, but second one that we used to resolve the contradiction between the braitot in a way that doesn't contradict what Abaye said. And basically taking Rabbi Yirmia's insult to Abaye, there's no way you could say this because this is the only way to resolve the contradiction, is not true. Okay, there's two different ways to resolve the contradiction, and Abaye theoretically could hold by any one of them. Okay, so we're left with that Rabbi Yirmia disagrees with Abaye about, we have this machloket, can kodshim kalim be eaten when there's no mizbeach or when the mizbeach is damaged? Okay, Abaye says no, Rabbi Yirmia says yes. Okay. Now we have 3 sugyot today, basically, all about the Mizbeach. The first one was about if the Mizbeach is damaged, continuation from yesterday, can you eat kodshim kalim? Second issue, Amar Rav Huna, Amar Rav, Mizbeach shel Shilo shel avanim haya. Okay, this is probably being brought up here. First of all, we're talking about the Mizbeach in general. And we talked about, if you remember, that whole machloket, Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi, about Shlomo HaMelech switched, right? Remember, he switches from the Mizbeach Nechoshet of Moshe to this Mizbeach Avanim that he built. Well, now Rav Huna says in the name of Rav, even in Shilo there was a Mizbeach Avanim. How do we know that? Ditanya, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer, Mata Mulamar Avanim, 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 Shalosh Pa'amim. 3 times in the Torah it mentions an altar built of stone. Okay, in Shmot, Parakaf, it says, if you're going to build me Mizbeach Avanim, don't build it gazit, don't use don't use don't use iron on it, because those are weapons. I don't want that involved in building the Mizbeach of stone. Then at the end of Sefer Dvarim, they're commanded that when they get into the land, Ubanit Hashem Mizbeach LaHashem, you're supposed to build the Mizbeach, and in fact in Yoshua they do it, they build the Mizbeach right when they get into the land. And it says there, Mizbeach Avanim, okay? And then it says, build me a Mizbeach Avanim. Says the same thing again. Lo tanif alei barzel, don't use iron on it. And the next pasuk says, Avanim shleimot tivnei mizbach Hashem Elokecha, build it with whole stones. So 3 references to stone altar in the Torah. So therefore, he says, what are these 3 references to? Echad shel Shilo, echad shel Nov Giv'on, ubeit Olami. So the last one is the Beit HaMikdash. Okay, that's what we saw. Shlomo built a mizbeach of stone. The first one is Shilo, the tabernacle in Shilo, which was the Mishkan was there for a very long period of time, and one in Nov and Givon. Okay, why are Nov and Givon together and Shilo separate? Good question. That's where the Mishkan kind of moved after it was in Shilo. First of all, the Aron HaBrit wasn't in Nov and Givon, and you were allowed to do sacrifices in other bamot, whereas in Shilo you weren't. Shilo had a certain prominence that they didn't have. So let's just go with that. Now, so you have one in Shilo, one in Nov and Givon, one in Beit Olamim. What do you see from Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov? That the one in Shilo was stone. Okay, so what? Well, Mativ Rav Acha bar Ami. Rav Acha bar Ami says, what are you talking about? It says, Eish yardam min hashamayim. Okay, here's a tannaitic source. A fire came down. This is actually in Seder Olam. It's a midrash, or a book of collection of tannaitic materials. Eish yardam min hashamayim b'mei Moshe. The fire that came down in the time of Moshe, there was a holy fire that came down from God, like a divine fire. A miracle happened, and that same fire remained throughout. It never went out. Okay, and it was there from the time of Moshe all the way to the time of Shlomo. Now, if that's the case, it means that they were still using the Mizbach and Nechoshet. They weren't using a different Mizbach, because the fire obviously stayed on the Mizbach. So, how do we explain that? So, and just to continue that source, there was a fire that came down in the time of Shlomo, which was different than the one in Moshe's time. That until King Menashe came. He was king who worshipped Avodah Zarah. You might remember him from, we learned about him besides from the Tanakh, but we learned about him in Perek Chelek. He was one of those who did tshuva. But before he did tshuva, he destroyed, he was worshipping Avodah Zarah, and he destroyed the Mizbachot. So he destroyed the Mizbach. So because he destroyed the Mizbach, obviously the fire of Shlomo was no longer there. Okay, now, if the Mizbach Avanim, it was really Mizbach Avanim in Shilo, mi karahu di stali clay. Well, then they must have stopped using the Mizbach and the Choshed in the time of Shilo. They used this new Mizbach. It shouldn't be there anymore. How could the fire have remained until the time of Shlomo? So to resolve this contradiction against what Rav Huna quoted in the name of Rav about this Mizbach of Shilo, we say, Huda Amar Karabi Natan. He holds like a different tannaitic opinion. Again, like we saw before, tannaitic debate about this, okay? Tannaitic debate, Tanya, Rabbi Natan Omer, Mizbeach shel Shilo shel Nechoshet haya. It was Nechoshet, but not Nechoshet like the one of Moshe. Okay, let's just talk about the one of Moshe. The one of Moshe was made of wood. It was plated. It had copper plating on the outside of it, and it was filled inside with adama, with soil, or the ground. So, Mizbeach of Shilo was Nechoshet, but it was chalul. It was hollow in the inside, umalei avanim, and it was filled with stone. So, meaning he had a stone altar, basically. And according to Rabbi Natan, it was not the same one as Moshe, and therefore comes the difficulty on Rav Huna in the name of Rav, and they answered, don't worry about that. Yes, it's true. One source says this fire, heavenly fire, came down and was used all the way into the time of Shlomo, but he holds by a different Tana, Rabbi Natan. Now Rashi asks a good question. He says, why didn't we say he holds like Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov? Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov is also a Tana, and he said there's 3 avanim, 3 times in the Torah, 3 mizbachot that were made of stone, right? And basically, or it was in Shilo, there was in Yovin Givon, and there was, I don't know if it was a different one, but it shows that Mizbeach was stone in the time of Shilo. Why didn't we use that? So Rashi says, Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov is talking theoretically, not that it actually happened, but there were 3 times in the Torah saying you could, if you want, build one of stone. In Shilo, you could build one of stone. In Yovin Givon, you could do it in the time of the temple, but he didn't necessarily say it actually happened. And Rabbi Natan is testifying that it actually happened. And that really supports Rav, because Rav is talking about, or Rav Huna in the name of Rav, that what was actual. Okay, so that's Rashi's explanation. Theoretically, it's not a bad question. Why? If the question's a good question. Why didn't we just say he holds like Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov, which is we quoted? Anyway, we now have a resolution. There were 2 opinions. Was the Mizbeach and Shilo really stone? Or if the fire was for the time of Moshe, then presumably it was the same altar, and in Shilo they were using a different altar. Now, Rav Nachum or Yitzchak gives a different resolution to this contradiction. Instead of saying there's a machloket about it, he basically says, "My lo nistalka." What does it mean? The fire of Moshe kept going. Lo nistalka levatala. It wasn't completely canceled out, meaning it still existed, even though it wasn't the altar that they were using in general. In other words, there was this miracle that happened. They took with them. They had the Mizbeach of Moshe, and they had this new one they built of stone. And the fire on the Mizbeach of Moshe was still there. But they were really using the other altar. So now they say, Maihi. Well, then what was the point of having this fire if they weren't even using the altar? So we're going to have 2 explanations. Rabbanan Amre, Shevi V'hava Mishadre. It would send over sparks to kind of keep the fire going on the altar they were actually using. So there were sparks going from the Moshe, from the one of Moshe, from the one that had all the old, divine given fire, that would throw sparks onto the altar and help things go. Rav Papa Amar, Ushpiza Havanakiv, Zimnahacha v'Zimnahacha. The fire was like a guest. Guest goes sometimes here, sometimes there. They move around. So the fire would kind of jump back and forth from altar to altar. Okay. Now, that was second sugya about the Mizbeach and Shilo, was it stone or not? And like I said, this probably came up, I'm guessing, because we had this whole thing about the Mizbach and the Choshet of Moshe that was replaced in the time of Shlomo, and here we learn that maybe there was some other altar that was really used more and not really the Mizbach and the Choshet of Moshe. It perhaps was taken with them, but it wasn't really in such use. Maybe it was used a little bit for the fire that was on it, okay? Or maybe there were just different opinions about whether it was used or whether it wasn't used, and there were 2 different approaches. Now we bring up a Mishnah in Midot. Okay, we're going to get to Midot soon in the cycle. It's in kodshim. It's all about the measurements of the temple. Tananatam. That's when those maps we were talking about are going to come in handy. So, Ukshalu b'nei agola, hosifu alav 4 amot min hadarom va4 amot min hama'arav kimin gama. When they came in the Second Temple time period, okay, the Mizbeach in the time of Shlomo was 28 by 28 cubits. Okay, we talked about 20 by 20 yesterday. That was the space of the Ma'aracha. I forgot to mention that, because we were comparing the 1 by 1 cubit space of Moshe to the 20 by 20 of Shlomo. 20 by 20 was the Ma'aracha, but it was 28 by 28. Now, we know that the Mizbeach in Bayit Sheni was 32 by 32. So what happened? Now we're going to see why it became 32 by 32. So they added 4 amot, 4 cubits on the south and on the west. Like a gamma, which is like a kaf sofit, but really in this case it's more like a resh because it's square, right? So they added. Now, if you take a square, okay, I really need a picture of this. I didn't do a fancy thing about this, but if you take a square and then you add a piece on both sides, you're going to end up with a square, okay? It sounds like you're not going to end up with a square exactly, but you are going to end up with a square. Because by adding it on 2 sides, 4 cubits and 4 cubits wide, you're going to end up with a complete square, okay? Sounds like, although I don't know, but it sounds like the opinion that the yesod was actually on all 4 sides, because in the end they got a square of 32 by 32. But maybe you could still explain it otherwise. Okay, now, when they came from the Golah, they added 4 cubits to the altar. Big question, why? So today we're going to have one answer and then get off on something else, which seems to also be perhaps connected to an answer. And the first answer we're going to have is Rav Yosef. And tomorrow's daf, and this is important to tell you so that you follow where we're going, Rav Yosef is going to bring two other suggestions as to why, okay, and this isn't his only answer to the question. Okay, so it's going to continue into tomorrow. So comes Rav Yosef and he says, I'm Rav Yosef, Mishum Shelo Sipek. It wasn't enough. They had more korbanot going, so they needed a bigger altar. That's usually the reason why you expand, right? You expand in your house because you have, no space for things, so you do a renovation. Here they did a renovation on the altar. They needed more space for more korbanot. Amarle Abaye, now his prized student Abaye, who loves to question Rav Yosef, says, what are you talking about? Hashta mikdash rishon dichtiv be Yehuda v'Yisrael rabim kechol asher al hayam. Says in Bayit Rishon, it says that there were so many people that they were like the sand by the sea. Mikdash sheni dichtiv be kol hakal ke'echad arba ribo, etc. And it's like something like 42,000. Yeah, here achad ribo alpayim shlosh me'ot shishim, 42,360. Okay, so let's compare 42,360 people in Bayit Sheni, infinite number of people in Bayit Rishon. Okay, obviously more people in Bayit Rishon. Obviously, it depends how literally you take. They were like the sand on the sea. But assuming you take it literally, infinite number of people, much fewer people in Abaye Sheni. If there were much fewer people, it doesn't make any sense. You needed more space on the altar. That's counterintuitive. We're assuming there's a direct correlation between the number of people who were living at the time to number of korbanot. Makes sense. Well, so now, what does he answer him? Amarle, hatam esh, it has nothing to do with how many people. There in the first temple, esh shel shamayim mesayatan. There was a heavenly fire that helped. Remember, they said that there was a fire of Moshe that went to Shlomo, right? And then that fire of Shlomo was destroyed in the time of Menashe. So there was no more heavenly fire in Bayit Sheni. So in Bayit Rishon, they had a heavenly fire that would help. Now, what's the issue of the space? You're burning a lot of meat. It takes a while till everything burns. You can't put piles and piles of meat when they take a while to burn. But in Bayit Rishon, they burned so quickly because there was a heavenly fire involved. Ki'ata Ravin. Okay, now this seems to be another reason why they expanded on the altar. When Ravin came, Amar Rishuma ben Pazi Mishum bar Kapara, Shitin Hosifu. Okay, they added these two holes. What holes? Okay, these are not to be confused with the two holes in the Yesod. Okay, and I see your comment, Debbie. Yes, on the map in the temple of the Machon HaMikdash, the Yesod is only on two sides. Machloket Rav and Levi, right? Does it go on two sides, or does it completely, right? Was it completely covering all sides? That's a Machloket, and the map sides on the Machloket that it was on two sides only. Okay, perhaps you could get there from here also. It's not clear, but anyway, that's an issue. Now we talk about, and there were two holes, if you remember. They're near each other, but one, right, the Yesod jutted out, according to the opinion, it was only on two sides, jutted out a little to the south, a little bit to the east, on the side where it wasn't. And there were two holes. One was on the southwest side, one was a little toward the west more, and one was a little toward the south. And that's where they would pour the blood from the extra remainder of the blood. That's not what we're talking about here. There were another two holes. Where were these two holes? These two holes were put in the second temple at the top of the altar. We're going to see where they were put. They added these two shitim. Now, why did they put them there, and what was the point? And what happened before there were holes? So, what happened was they would pour the libations there. And they would pour the libations into these holes. Now, the Mizbeach, we said, was solid, but they had holes here that went down from these holes at the very top of the altar, 10 cubits in height. They went all the way down, and when they got to the bottom, to the floor, there was a pit down there. And the nisachim would be absorbed into the pit. Now, before they added these holes, what would they do? Well, remember, they expanded. So, right, so here's our picture where they expanded. Now, in this area where they expanded, there was a pit on the ground there. And what they did is they expanded, put the mizbeach over the pit where the nisachim used to go, and I'll explain to you in a minute how they would get there before. And they covered the pit, so that instead of going, and this is how they would go by Rishon, you would pour it over the side of the altar, and it would drip down the side of the altar, of the wall, drip down the wall, and go straight down into the pit. But they realized that was a problem because they said the following. Mikar sever, in the beginning they thought Mizbach Adama, Shuatum Adama. When it says in the Torah Mizbach Adama, it has to be completely solid and full. So they couldn't have it go down straight to the bore into the altar because the altar couldn't have an open space in there. Couldn't be hollow anywhere. Had to be full. But Levasof Sevel, Shtiaka Achila. Then they realized that drinking was like eating. Okay, what does that have to do with anything? Well, the libations are liquid and the meat is food. Now, the meat that you burn on the altar or the fats that you burn on the altar have to be completely burned on the altar. So they say likewise, the libations, which are liquids, have to be completely absorbed, swallowed up by the altar. And therefore it needs to actually go through the altar and not down the wall of the altar into the pit. So what they did is they built over the pit, which explains why they need to expand, and then had holes, had it hollow where they built in that area where you could pour the libations down the holes. This is, by the way, for wine libations. And the Nisuch HaMayim that they did, that's why we have some Chot Beis HaShoeva, because they would do the special halacha of Nisuch HaMayim. It was a big machlokah, Prushim, Tzdukim. Tzdukim said you don't do this. But the Prushim said you do Nisuch HaMayim, and they would pour it through the hole, the water, and it would go straight down into the pit, but through the altar walls. So in the beginning, they thought it had to be completely solid. Then they realized that no, because the libations have to be absorbed by the altar, just like the meat does. So therefore, they wanted it to go through the altar, and therefore they expanded to have these two holes. Now, my Mizbach Adama. Well, then how do you explain Mizbach Adama? If it doesn't mean you have to fill the whole thing up. Shu mechubar ba'adama. It has to be completely attached to the ground. Shelo yivnenu lo al gabei kifin, that you don't build it on arches, v'lo al gabei mechilot, and not on top of tunnels. Okay, so it has to be on the ground without tunnels going underneath. Okay, obviously there was some pit underneath, but that's a little different, right? And that pit was for the libations to go into there. Okay, that's the end of our daf. So there were three main topics. One was machloket, Abaye and Rabbi Yirmia about kodshim kalim. Can they be eaten when there's no altar? Again, presuming you did all the stuff when there was still an altar and the altar was in good shape, and then it got damaged and you're just left with the meat. Are you allowed to eat the meat or not? Abaye says no. Rabbi Yirmia said yes. And the contradiction that Rabbi Yirmia brought, we had two other ways to resolve the contradiction to have it fit with Abaye. Then we got to Rav Huna, Rav, who said the the altar in Shilo was made of stone. By the way, the topic of Gefet this week is all about the Mizbach Nechoshen and some problem in the pshat of the psukim the pshat of this Gemara that doesn't work with the psukim that Rashi and Tosfot have a big debate about, or a big explanation of how to deal with it. Anyway, more on the Mizbach Nechoshen you can listen in Gefet. The Mizbach of Shilo was stone. Either there's a machloket about what it really was, or there's a way to explain that the fire of Moshe continued on the Mizbach Nechoshet, the divine fire that came from there. You can maybe possibly explain that there were two altars going and the fire was still there, and we had two explanations as to what that fire was used for. Then we had the third sugya, which is about the expansion of the altar, and we're still in the middle of that sugya. Why they expanded the altar in Bayacheni from 28 by 28 to 32 by 32. Either, right, we have Rav Yosef who said because it wasn't big enough, which Abaye said, how could that be? But we had the answer of the fire. Heavenly fire wasn't there anymore to help things move along quicker. And so it doesn't have to do with population. It has to do with the strength of the fire. And also divine intervention. And then we had this issue of the shitin, which is they wanted to cover up the pit and have it go straight through the Mizbeach because they realized it needed to be absorbed by the Mizbeach. And then, like I said, we're going to get back to Rav Yosef, and he's going to have two other suggestions as to why they expanded the altar in the time of Bayit Sheni. With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone Shabbat Shalom.